Sunday morning in Atlanta. All right, I see people coming on in. When person, come on in. Come on in. Come on in. I see folk are coming on in. Morning to my people on the West Coast. Noon. Good afternoon. I've got some amazing guests with us today. Come on in. Come on in. Let me know that you're out there. And when you come in,
I feel the urge while we're waiting for Doc's
yes,
connection to
yes.
kind of get us started. As a son of Dr. Simmons, I'll take this privilege and allow her to be mad at me later for moving on the experience. But when she jumps back in, once the technical issue is fixed, I know that she'll lead us in this conversation. So as we are waiting for Dr. Simmons, hopefully all of you all who are here can hear me. I see Kamari is telling me I can take the lead, so that means the audience can hear us for another episode of Preaching and Preachers with Dr. Simmons, which we know has been a significant resource to Black churches, Black clergy, Black lay folk on a range of issues across the last several years. And so it is an honor to be here today to talk about a subject that is sometimes foreign and disconnected from how we often think about faith practices and what it means to do ecclesial life. But we have some amazing panelists who live at that intersection of spirituality, however we can define that in very constructive and expansive ways, and this work of abolition, which we also know carries various shades and grades and spectral life. And so I'm actually going to allow each of the panelists to introduce themselves briefly, and hopefully by the time we finish the introductions, Dr. Simmons will be with us. And so I'm going to go to Dr. Tabatha first, who I had the privilege of working with in the Abolitionist Sanctuary that was founded by its executive director, Dr. Nakia Robert. And so, Dr. Tabatha, say hello to us.
Good morning to the West Coast and good afternoon to the East Coast. And wherever you are on this earth, it is a good day to be alive. I am so grateful to be with you. I identify as an abolitionist organizer, a minister. I'm also a professor. I teach at Azusa Pacific University. And I lead the Womanist and Black Feminist Abolitionist Collective, which is a incubator for researchers who want to take seriously the ideas and visions of dreams of Black feminists and womanists and abolitionists. And I'm a member of Clergy for Black Lives Matter, Grassroots, and also participate in lots of coalition work, particularly in Los Angeles, around organizing for a people's budget. We have the very first Black woman mayor, Karen Bass, and we've been organizing to really pressure our city officials for a people's budget that centers the needs of the people and divests from systems of harm. So it's a real honor to be in community with y'all.
All right. Olivia, introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everyone. It's great to be with you today. My name is Olivia Buckley, and I'm a community organizer based in Washington, D.C. I grew up in Florida for the most part, and so I'm also a member of the Dream Defenders and have begun some abolitionist organizing with them as well. But I've been most a part of local abolitionist groups here in DC that sprung up during the 2020 uprisings. So groups like Lib Readers and Total Liberation Collective, which formed in friendship communities of folks who felt helpless, felt frustrated, and wanted to channel their rage into something productive. And so from my own professional community organizing experience, it's been a real blessing to get to marry that with my own personal abolitionist practice. I work for an organization called Washington Interfaith Network. And so my job is primarily with clergy, with religious people practicing their spirituality. And the ways that manifests often ends up in abolitionist directions without those explicit labels. And so I've been living in the tension of what it's like to articulate those things in ways that aren't intimidating or that are more approachable.
Okay. Erica, introduce yourself.
Well, I am so grateful to be here today to come and represent that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew who, when he stepped on the scene, he said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, to the house of Bethany, the protocos, those made poor by society, to heal the brokenhearted, to set those who were oppressed at liberty, and to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord now," which meant the Jubilee. If you read Deuteronomy 15, it means canceling of all debts. And so Jesus closed the book. He said, "Today, that scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." And he said, it is I who will do it. I didn't come here to be status quo. I came here to set it off. And so I follow that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew. I am the founder of Set It Off movement, and I believe that Jesus was the originator of the abolition movement. If we look at Luke 4:18 through 21, I mean, Jesus basically said anti-poverty. Come on, somebody. He said, we don't need to have it. It shouldn't be here. He said, no prisons, because I came to set the captive free. There we go. Shouldn't have no prisons. And to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord now, which meant the canceling of our debts. I bet you I'm not paying no student loan debts to these governments, because my Lord and Savior told me at the end of the day that this is the time of the Lord to act. And so we shouldn't have to be going into debt and to bondage for paying student loans. So at the end of the day, I believe that Set It Off movement is just coming as another iteration of Christ's movement of doing the abolition work in the earth to say, no, this is not God's way. This is capitalism's way.
Ashe. I think that might have shut down the internet. Brother Willie Francois.
That's what happens in that's what happens in a white technocracy. It can't handle that at one time. As we wait for Dr. Simmons to come back, I am Willie Dwayne Francois III, pastor of the Mount Zion Baptist Church in New Jersey, associate professor of liberation theology at New York Theological Seminary, where I have the privilege of doing life with, journeying alongside men and women who are incarcerated at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility and Sing Sing Correctional Facility. We offer the only master's degree program of any in the state of New York at any prison. We believe that we're the oldest program to be operated by a seminary that actually grants master's degrees to incarcerated persons. And that work, approaching that work as an abolitionist, allows me to think about what it means to be an educator in carceral death-making spaces, as one who journeys with men and women as they reassert their humanity in such dehumanizing contexts, building power alongside of them, and ultimately being in the lives of people who will ultimately be on the front line of the abolitionist movement. Is always very true that those who are closest to these forms of domination, those who are most impacted by these forms of domination, have the solutions. And so that's how I enter those classrooms. That's how I enter into movement space, understanding that I am called to follow incarcerated and former incarcerated people to do this work of abolition. And I'm excited to be in conversation with my sisters today.
All right. I hope I can be heard now. Can I hear your hand if you can hear me?
Yes, Doc, we hear you loud and clear. I think we ready.
All right, let's go straight to the question. All right. Let's start with you. How did you get involved in abolitionist efforts?
Sure. So I remember unpacking terms like imperialism and neocolonialism in college and wondering why they resonated so much. And then I realized in my own personal experience, I'd been touched by the carceral system without it being explicitly the prison system. And so when I reflected on my childhood in public schools in Florida, where my friends were being sent to detention and suspension and then ultimately imprisoned, I realized that that was part of a broader, more global plan to extract labor from people. And when I read things like The New Jim Crow, I was putting together the pieces of these systems. And as a young adult, basically a teenager and then into my young adulthood, honestly, it sent me into a spiritual depression. I remember feeling devastated that the world that I'd been taught existed was operating in ways behind the scenes that were actively trying to destroy me and my loved ones. And so that realization
Yes.
galvanized me, and forced me to rely on a spiritual power to carry that forward. Because without that, what hope can we have? And then it brought me into organizing spaces, into community with other people who were identifying the same systems on a grand scale, but more specifically in their own personal lives in the ways that I had. So, for example, like I just got a call from my friend who's incarcerated in Virginia just now. And I met him through some abolitionist, look, he's calling me again, through some abolitionist organizing I was doing in 2020, and now he's my brother. And so that kind of relationship is really what brought me into abolitionist organizing.
All right, Dr. Jolivet, tell us how you got involved in abolitionist work.
I'm so glad that you're asking this question, because, it got me thinking about, was there a single moment? And the reality is that there wasn't a single moment that I got involved, but there was a moment of crisis that I think helped me to understand the impossibility of the world that is, right? And the demand of abolition that must be now. I think I'm feeling that on a day like this, in the midst of the extraordinary impossibility that we are having a conversation right now while genocide is happening, right? Like moments like this crystallize why this conversation is so relevant. So, Doc, thank you for convening a discussion like this. On February 23rd of 2000, I got one of those calls in the middle of the night. It's always in the middle of the night when it happens. My brother tearfully called to say, she's dead, she's dead, she's dead. And when we finally figured out what he was trying to say, he conveyed to us that my cousin, Dee Dee, who was at the time 31, the same age as my daughter right now, was murdered by her husband in a home next door to my grandmama's house. In the community of Sunnyside, where all of our people have been in Houston, Texas. And I remember in that moment and in the moments that followed, that was an impossible thing that nobody, the cops, nobody, the church, nobody had answers to be able to sustain what was needed to be able to survive what we needed in that moment as a family. And I began then to question, because I was in seminary education at the time. And I found that what I was learning about God was incomplete and could not respond to the material conditions that my family was facing. What they were telling us about what was going to happen to the man, my cousin's husband, who murdered her, could not respond to what her babies who were left to survive needed, because their daddy killed her. And for the police who stood outside of our family's house and did nothing for hours, they could not have saved her life. I began to understand that I needed different resources to make sense of what was happening. So it set me on a path, frankly, that took me outside of the walls of the church, and it took me outside of the legitimized resources of the academy. And so it frankly took me to womanism and Black feminism, and it took me to ultimately the resources of abolition. And so when I think about, and here's a name that I think we all should know, someone like Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who concretizes language that helps to explain what we experience when she says, our communities have experienced organized abandonment. We know this in Sunnyside in Houston, Texas.
Yeah.
I knew that when I experienced what was happening in Houston, Texas, when my cousin was murdered. And the people of Palestine know this right now. There is a through line that all of us can speak to when we begin to understand our lived experience. That's what ultimately, I think, set me on the path of abolition. And I could not have used that language in 2000. But it's because of moments over time that I think ultimately I found my way with my students, with community. When Trayvon Martin was murdered, for example, we were organizing on my campus. to try to intuitively figure out what are we going to do to say we refuse to consent to the murder of our people. We refuse to accept that this is the only way to live, right? And that ultimately led me to the work of organizing in the streets, and ultimately to trying to organize in the sanctuary simultaneously. So that's been my story, and it is an unfolding story. And it's the story, I believe, as Sister Erica has said, it's the story of a revolutionary, Jesus, who refuses to accept a whitewashed, colonized theology that doesn't contend with reality that he was himself executed by the empire and the state. So that's been my story, and I'm gonna just stop right there because I know others want to jump in.
Yeah, Reverend Williams, jump in. Reverend Williams, how did you become involved in abolitionist efforts?
So I remember reading a quote by Malcolm X back in 2012, and I'm paraphrasing this, so don't y'all come for me when I don't say it correctly. But Malcolm basically said, when you have poor communities, you will have poor schools. When you have poor schools, you will have poor areas. I mean, it was basically showing how poverty impacts the whole lifeline of a person. And so at that time, I was a director of a Boys and Girls Club in Michigan. And I'm watching these children that are going to the schools that are dilapidated, that don't have access to the books and stuff that they need. I'm like, how the hell are they learning when they literally are just being babysat every day? But here I am, also a minister at a church where the pastor got mad that we wouldn't buy him a new Cadillac while he had two cars sitting in his driveway. And so I was like, something is wrong with this conversation, because I believe that the church should be having some dialogue as to why are these children going to schools that are going to set them up for failure for the rest of their lives. And so I began to start praying and saying, Spirit, what is it that you are trying to show me? And so I remember reading a quote by Dr. King that said, any religion that is only concerned about the souls of a person, but not the slums that damn them, is a religion basically waiting to be obsolete. And so I said, okay, God, what are you saying? What does that mean? And so in 2013, I literally left everything in Michigan and moved to DC and went to Howard University School of Divinity. And I must say the name of my dear Shiro, Dr. Gay Byron, who we are praying and believing God for a miracle. And I know that God will bring her through, because that woman has been such a blessing to my life and to so many others on this road of doing this work of abolition. And so when I say I went to Howard, that was the place that got me connected to groups that began to show me that, yeah, no, that foolishness you being taught at your church back home in Michigan, that ain't it. What we recognize is when you read the liberation theology, when you read the work of Fannie Lou Hamer, and you read the work of Harriet Tubman and all these Black women who said, no, this is not the way that our communities should look. They should have access. They should not be abandoned. And so therefore I got connected to groups, especially the Cairo Center for Religion, Rights, and Social Justice in New York. And I started to understand that poverty needed to be abolished. So I got to be very clear about my entrance to this abolition work. I believe it starts with ending poverty, because we all know that when you check people who are behind closed doors, who are in cage, it is because they are poor. They poor, as my grandma said. They so poor they can't afford the O and the R. And so in capitalism, if you can't do nothing for them, they're going to lock you up. They're going to find a way to put you out. And that is why we must look at this issue of poverty, because at the end of the day, that is what continues to cause our communities to die and put us in predicaments where we don't have a choice, but have to do what we got to do to survive. That's what them sisters did and set it off. Did they not? If you ain't seen the movie, go look it up. 1996, Queen Latifah, Jada Pinkett Smith, Kimberly Elise, and Vivica Fox, them Black women, like Black women always do, they set it off because they said, we're going to get free or die trying, period.
Yeah, so I entered the abolitionist space sort of backhandedly. One, I was in college. I was at Morehouse, and I just read Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. And I mean, obviously, that's one of those manifesto texts that sort of radicalized so many of us around this issue. It is one of those sacred texts that has journeyed with me for so long now. But I was really searching for ways of interpreting and understanding what happened to my cousins. Right? I grew up in Galveston, Texas. I have home of Juneteenth. I have this very close relationship with some of my older cousins, and they were disappearing. Right, and as they were disappearing, there was no rationale for their disappearance. There was no one actually trying to close the grief gaps around their disappearance. Like literally, these brothers would just not be around for months and years at a time. And our family would say things like, oh, they're in the Bahamas. Oh, they're in college. Oh, they went up the road. And in my, youth, I don't understand that these are shame-based metaphors for how we talk about prison, right? And I'm thinking about us as Jesus people. I'm a product of the First Union Baptist Church, Galveston, Texas, 1027 Avenue K 77550, right? That's where I grew up. And I, in college, I'm reading Michelle Alexander, and I'm trying to figure out, why is it that Jesus people who are spiritual descendants of, people who are students of, people who are followers of a man who was terrorized by his own criminal justice system, a criminal legal system, why is it that we as faith folk don't know how to talk in very honest language and very prophetic language about what prisons are actually doing to us? And so it's Michelle Alexander who gave me that language when I'm really just trying to figure out what happened to my cousins, right? And also trying to figure out, how did it happen to them and not me? Same church, same familial upbringing, same circles, same schools even, but some sort of way I was able to break through whatever cracks existed in these carceral walls to go on to college, and they go to prison, right? And so I started thinking of myself as, I know we often use language of the school to prison pipeline, but we don't ever talk about what the actual pipeline is and how we all live in it, right? Some of us escape it in some way. Some of us are able to extend the runway a little bit, but all of us who are Black and brown and poor, we live within this pipeline and we don't even know it. And so I was drawn into this work simply by trying to figure out what happened to my cousins and why didn't it happen to me? How do I, and part of what that was trying to navigate my own survivor's remorse around me moving on, but these brilliant brothers are cycling in and out of prison. These brilliant brothers are going to the Bahamas and going to college without any recourse or without any check to the system. And so it's actually my family that brings me to this work. And it is, and I say backhandedly because like Erica, I have evolved to understand that all of these systems are interlocking, right? That you can't talk about the prison system disconnected from the healthcare system, disconnected from the public education system, disconnected from the banking system. All of these systems are inherently a part of a conspiracy of racial capitalism, and all of it must be abolished. All of it must go if we're going to have Black freedom and Black power in this country. But if we're ever going to have anything called a democracy and not just a kleptocracy in this country, all these systems have to be detangled and dismantled and reconstructed in some very acute ways.
That's right. That's right.
Olivia, we're church folk. Tell me what you believe churches can do to engage in abolitionist efforts. And this is that Black radical stuff about, what do you think can do, and what does it look like?
Thank you so much, Dr. Simmons. I love this question because it's one that I wake up with every morning. So I also grew up in the church. I, was part of the church for 26 years. And so I know what that language is like, what that movement is like, to both have such a deep sense of spiritual commitment and be committed to practices and hierarchies in some ways, and traditions. And so none of those things are bad, but it often keeps us from exploration, and they often can prohibit us from imagining different worlds, because we're so used to we're so used to our own experience of one. And so when I work with the church folks through Washington Interfaith Network, my organization is not explicitly abolitionist. So my own personal beliefs are not at the forefront of the organizing that we do. And oftentimes the conversations I have with people are, I'm fearful, I'm scared of my neighbors who might hurt me, of the cops who might also hurt me, of the multiple opportunities that there are for this world to, as Dr. Jones said, to organize an abandonment against me. And what that looks like in community is often the disinvestment of resources for schools, for hospitals and medical care. And so when I think about what churches can do, I think about a very practical resolution of stepping in the gap between those failed opportunities for the state that should be providing services to their people, for us to provide for our people. And again, I like to use language that is generative. And so, yes, abolition means destroying some things, right? But it also means birthing new things. And that is what I really try to get people to see in my conversations with them when I ask them, okay, even if we got you a security camera outside, would that prevent someone from coming to hurt you? Or even if we got a police officer, would that actually prevent any violence? Unfortunately, the answer is no. And so when we have deeper conversations about the brokenness that's happening in our communities, what often results is the need for forgiveness, the need for compassion, the need for radical honesty, and for distribution of wealth. Those are all Christian principles. I don't see how we get away from the church when we come back to those core things. And that's really the work of the healing, and, as I said, the generative practice that I feel is abolition. And it's inescapable within the realm of the church. We just have to remind people that that's also their work.
That's right.
Dr. Tabatha, you want to take a swing at how we should re-envision, ecclesial ethics and church work in the world around this?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question. And I think it's a question of also noticing what we forget. And this is a Sankofa moment. And Sankofa, of course, is a reminder to reach back for that which we have forgotten.
Mm-hmm.
What church can do right is mutual aid. Think about mutual aid societies. This is where Black church can be brilliant, right?
Mm-hmm.
Community care is really the hallmark of, I think, the genius of Black church. You think about the era of Reconstruction, as our people are emerging out of enslavement, right? We've abolished slavery, and yet all types of white supremacist terrorism is emerging in the early 20th century. You've got lynchings and the KKK forming, and all this stuff is happening. And what are we doing? We're building mutual aid societies as church people. We're building communities of protection as church people, right? Let us make sure that we invest in the things that we have forgotten, because those cultures of care are what abolition is about. So that as we abolish systems of harm, which are always rooted in white supremacist violence, right? We then nurture systems of care, which fundamentally are at the root of the gospel. When Jesus says, I came that you may have life and life abundantly, this is what most of us mean when we say abolition. This is what we mean when we say abolition. Let us root out harm and invest and seed care. And so I think very practically about these kinds of things. And at the very core of it, I think, is deep study. I think all too often in our churches, and I might get in trouble for this, so y'all feel free to call me in and pray for a sister. I think we rely too heavily upon sort of the expertise, and we should do this, of course, of those of us who are trained theologians, right? We rely so heavily on the expertise of trained theologians, and they're the ones who are responsible for teaching the people. And we leave the people simply to receive this banking model of religious education as if the people don't have something to say about what the gospel is doing in their lives. And so cultivating a culture within our churches of deep study that allows for the people to join in solidarity with those of us who have religious education, theological education, to bear witness to the work of the gospel in their lives. That might in fact help us to decolonize and decarcerate our theology. And it might also help us to change the way our churches construct auditoriums, where we don't have a single actor at the center of the stage telling the people what they need to know, but the people might in fact help to create the culture of what we collectively need to be doing ecclesiastically. And that's where the streets, I think, have something to teach us. And so for me, this is coming from Robin D.G. Kelley. Love, study, and struggle is the praxis. And that is the work that I see in Jesus's life. That is, to me, the work of abolition. And this is what I think the church is uniquely poised to do, if we are willing to give up our sense of being enamored with racial capitalism. If we're willing to give up our own sense of being enamored with racial capitalism in the church.
No, that's good, Doc, because I mean, when I think about this question, I think one is churches have to figure out what we mean by solidarity ethics, because I mean, often the way we think about solidarity, and I think this is Robin Kelley too, is that we often think about solidarity as needing to be with people with shared experiences, as opposed to needing to be with people with a shared vision and a shared sense of activism, an activist praxis that draws us into the work, right? What churches need to do when we think about solidarity ethics is to figure out not how we lead this movement, but how we follow in this movement. There's a hyper romanticization of the Black church as you know, we got civil rights because of the Black church. We have XYZ because of the Black church. And there's a way that we have become so ecclesio-centered that we don't understand that maybe the church is not quite equipped to lead a movement, and whether we are supposed to be contributing to and following in the movement. And I say that particularly because of what you just said, Doc, is when we think about, is the church leading, what we're often asking ourselves are, where are the clergy members? And generally what we're asking ourselves are, where are the male clergy members? Not realizing that when when the church is involved, that literally means the pew is engaged in this type of work. And so maybe we've gotten to a point in the history of freedom and justice where churches and clergy have to figure out what it means to follow and not try to be at the forefront of certain movements. That's the first thing I would say. I think another thing churches have to do is we have to de-chattel our theology, right? We talk about decolonizing it. I'm using the very American metaphor, is that the America's colonialism was genocide of Native Americans and the exploitation and extraction of Black labor and the imprisonment or the enslavement of Black flesh, which created a chattel imagination. We have to figure out how to de-chattel our churches. How do we begin to purge, particularly Black churches? How do we purge Black churches of this whiteness theology that causes us to lift Jesus as a militarist, to lift Jesus as an ally to capitalists, to lift Jesus as a white Christ, right? I often like to say, at some point, the church has to crucify its white Christ and leave him in the tomb, right? We need to stop resurrecting this white Jesus if we're actually going to be the way that Palestinian carpenter lived and died for us to be. So, and I often say this, as we have to, I love folk who have that great soteriology, and we talk about Jesus saving us. Well, it's time for us to save Jesus from Americanism, because the way Jesus has been packaged and the way Jesus has been shoved down the throats of dominated, unprotected peoples is deadly. It is genocide by theology. It's a slow genocide, but it's death nonetheless by theology. And so I think the church has to purge. It has to exercise some of those structural demons from its discourse, and that means that, and particularly as it relates to the prison industrial complex, we have to let go of our carceral apologetics. There are a lot of Christian doctrines, and I'm not saying the doctrines themselves are wrong, but the implications of these doctrines, the way these doctrines show up in public, are pretty disastrous. The way we sacralize work and hard work, the way we talk about bootstrapping from a theological lens is deadly to Black folk who we know are intentionally locked out of well-paying jobs, right? This idea of even sacrificial atonement, the way we talk about the sacrifice of one for the benefit of the many. I mean, that is inherently what white people say. We got to lock up as many Black people as we can so we can be safe, right? That is an implication that comes from Christian theology. The idea that God is an eternal punisher, right? And people are othered in such an ontological and existential way. All these things are upholding the ways we think about, or the ways we normalize how prisons are killing us, devouring us, othering us, and making us less human or non-human according to some particular template. We have to de-chattel our theology, and we got to do it now.
That's right. That's it.
Reverend Eric, if you want to hop in on what can the church do in this question of advancing the abolitionist cause, imagination, practices.
Well, y'all talking good in here today. Y'all got me ready to holler up in this hotel room right now, because y'all speaking what is actually, this is the conversations we need to have. And a couple of weeks ago, I actually sat and thought about what is the difference between the Black church and the white church. And literally, the only thing I could think about was race. And Black churches, we constantly are still talking about race. But we don't want to get to that conversation of sexism. Come on, somebody.
Come on.
We don't want to get to the issue of classism. Come on, somebody.
Come on.
We don't want to get to the issues of homophobia and transphobia. And so where we're stuck in this time, churches, is you still got a lot of Black male preachers who got bubblegum theology, who don't know Malachi from Matthew, and they still trying to teach and preach, and all they know is that one hoop, and it ain't doing nothing but sending people back into further hells that they live in. Ain't no hell that they gonna die and go to. I'm talking about the hells they living in, the slums they living in. And so what we have to get honest about is with our churches is that what is actually happening in our churches? Who are actually leading our churches? I'm going to be real clear today. My grandmother, Miss Willie G. Morris, who was a sharecropper from Dothan, Alabama, didn't have but an 8th grade education. But I always say she had a PhD in common sense. My grandmother used to clean people's toilets and scrub their floors for us to be able to live, okay? Like all that I have been able to do, that's what my grandmother should have been able to do. But she didn't have access to that. And so at the end of the day, what I know is my grandmother, she knew God in a real way. And we didn't have much. Our house was small. But when people were evicted from their homes, Granny would have them come stay with us. I look up after school, I come home, I'm like, who the hell is these people in our house? Granny like so-and-so gonna stay here for a little while till they get on their feet. Because my grandmother knew if we got a place, everybody got a place. And so now we've gone back to this ideal of rugged individualism in our churches where we think because you made it, you look good and God is with you, but it's actually the different part of it. Because when I look at real preachers who have done this work of gospel, I look at the lens of Fannie Lou Hamer. She was somebody who didn't have much. But she knew God was on her side and she was doing the work of justice in the church and outside of the church because she recognized that faith was the foundation of the fight. Faith was the foundation of the fight. And that is what Jesus used to do his work. That's why he had the authority to go up to tell Caesar and all these other folk, I bet you won't try me because I know who I am. And that's what the churches don't know who they are. They have become whitewashed tombs. They have become places of hell and death. And so that's why our communities are in shambles, because we as Black folks, we love church, we love God, and we love our spirituality. That's who we are. We are the spirit of the world. If you take Black folks out of this world, there would be no spirit. Y'all know white folks ain't got no spirit. They just as dried up. But at the end of the day, with our churches, we got to find the right spirit. We got to go back to grandma and all of these other folks who knew it wasn't in all of the theology you got. It's in the love that you show. And that's what Jesus taught us.
That's it. That's it. Amen. That's it.
All right. Olivia, so help churches get this and figure this stuff out. Do you have any resources, books that you can to churches?
Certainly. So before I get to my book recommendations,
sources.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yep, I hear you, Olivia.
Before I get to my book recommendations, I'd like to say that the best resources are some of the ones that have been named in this conversation in terms of looking back to our elders who've shared community with one another and held all things in common as the biblical principle guides us to. And so when we're trying to discern what the best step is in practicing abolition, it's for me been much more practical to have conversations with my elders, with my loved ones, with the people I'm already in community with before I get to theory, and then have the theory supplemented or have other voices kind of bring the pieces together. Again, as we've shared, our lived experiences have told us so much already, have taught us so much. And so we have the pieces, but these are some resources that I hope will be of support to people. So one of the texts that is what I think a phenomenal entryway is We Do This Till We Free Us by Miriam Kaba, Becoming Abolitionist by my friend Derica Purnell, Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, No More Police, A Case for Abolition, Practicing New Worlds, and Abolition for the People, The Movement for a Future Without Policing in Prisons. And then Defund Fear safety without policing, prisons, and punishment. So I can send, in the chat that list for everyone. I know I was sharing quite a few. But
Yes.
honestly, the work of abolitionists publicly has blown up in the past few years. So it does not take much to find these really profound resources. And I'm excited to see how many more people begin engaging with these texts, just based on curiosity.
Dr. Jolivet, any books or recommendations?
Yes, Doc, I want to echo what Olivia said about being in community with each other as the first place to start. That's the first place to start. Don't begin with something outside like a book. Begin with each other. And have those courageous conversations around meals and doing work together. I think that's the first place to start. And study your Bible. Go back to the places in your Bible that are familiar that you take for granted, because God might show you something new. That's the beauty of the living word, right? Because the biblical text points us to God. The living text is not God. It points us to the living God, right? Let the living God show you something new in the biblical text and beyond the biblical text. This is why we study and struggle and love. And if you want to nerd out a little bit, by returning to the work of our ancestors, I want to send you to W.E.B. Du Bois. W.E.B. Du Bois wrote Black Reconstruction. It's very dense, but he's one of the original sociologists. You got to go back to Black Reconstruction, where he coins the term abolition democracy that Angela Davis then writes a book about, right, in 2015. He's one of the original thinkers that, in the height of transmogrifying plantation slavery, chattel slavery, right, he's thinking about abolition in real time, and imagining an alternative world. So Black Reconstruction, I think, is necessary. And if you don't want to spend a whole bunch of time reading some academic text, go to the New York Times and Google Ruth Wilson Gilmore's article, "Is Prison Necessary?" Is prison necessary? You begin to understand that abolition is actually very simple, and it's gospel, in fact. She says, abolition means this: life is precious. And she says it again: life is precious. That's what Jesus is talking about. Life is precious. Let us end the death dealing and nurture that which brings life. Amen and ashe. I think Doc may be frozen again. Somebody else want to jump in on resources?
Yeah, I mean, I want to say that I like the starting point, that before we think about books, particularly those of us who are people of faith, I think we have to do a serious interrogation and revolutionizing of our spirituality, right? I talk about, just as a selfish plug, right? In Silencing White Noise, I try to gesture towards an abolitionist spirituality. Right. And I think an abolitionist spirituality transcends organized religion. It transcends the religious traditions, Abrahamic and otherwise, that we need to get to we have to figure out what does it mean to practice community with one another, to practice humanity with one another, that allows us to center lives and experiences of unprotected people, that we are invested in the work of thinking about abolition itself as a type of faith. I mean, it takes a significant amount of faith to believe that everything we've ever known cannot be, and everything we've never known can be. That is a serious faith proposition, to believe that the would be could be it's possible, right? So abolition itself, I think, is a type of spirituality. And now those are the kinds of conversations we need to have in Sunday school. Those are the conversations we need to have as we're reading the sacred text. Because, I mean, Jesus, of course, Jesus is an abolitionist. He comes from an abolitionist tradition, right? What relaunches the Jewish movement, the Hebrew movement, is emancipation from slavery, from biblical Egypt, right? Like that is God impacting a serious structure and policy that leads to bodily salvation. We got to go back to the text that is ours and figure out what are we lifting, and also figure out what we're contesting in that text. And so I think that's important. I would say, just by way of some fresh text, one, I think everyone should read Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Gibran Muhammad. I think people should pick up today Jeremy Williams' Criminalization in the Acts of the Apostles. And there's a new text I just finished by Benjamin Weber called American Purgatory. These are just some newer texts that allow us to think about what are we up against, right? And sometimes we don't really know what to do because we haven't even spent the time to diagnose what the sickness actually is. And you cannot have a serious prognosis without an accurate diagnosis.
That's right. That's right. Can I take the liberty to mention two more fast books? I neglected to say it, but I got to say real fast. Please read Viral Justice by Ruha Benjamin. Please read Viral Justice by Ruha Benjamin. I'll just leave it there. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
And if I could just
well,
jump
we
in,
have struggled through.
Sure. Oh, sure.
Go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say on that last note, Dr. Simmons, real quickly. I think in a lot of ways that we need to change our study is to change the speakers. And oftentimes we're always saying these names and books of Black males, and I'm not against my brothers. I love y'all. Willie is my ride or die brother. But I think we have to get back to the understanding of Black women, for the most part in this country, have always been abolitionists. They always make a way out of no way. Like they have had to go up against so many hard things to survive. And so when we talk about abolition, we have got to name Harriet Tubman. Like there is no way that we can even center this conversation by a woman who literally had her life on the line to go to be free. Like she felt like, if I don't be free, I'm going to die. And so a lot of folks are doing a lot of abolition work right now, but they really not about that life, because they really don't want to put their life on the line and get uncomfortable and give up some of their status quo stuff to be able to see abolition to come into materialism, to manifestation, excuse me, because we got a lot of our folks who are very comfortable. Y'all know that. I don't have to tell this group. I know I'm talking to the choir. A lot of our people are sitting at places of power, but won't do anything to make things change. And so the reason why I know we need to change the speakers is because a lot of our folks have access to these places, but are not doing anything. And the Spirit told me a couple months, the Spirit said, those who are paying, push, and those who are proximate to power, pause. And what I know to be true is a lot of our people are proximate to power and they're pausing. So go back and look at Harriet Tubman. Go back and look at Fannie Lou Hamer. Go back and look at all these Black women, Angela Davis and Sojourner Truth and all these women. Hell, go back and look at the National Welfare Rights Union, because they were the women who actually told Dr. King to do the Poor People's Campaign. Don't get it twisted. It was poor welfare mamas that said, nah, brother, we ain't able to feed our kids, so we need to do something about this economic injustice. So don't just look at those who have access to the power. Look at those who are facing the pain daily and know that their stories are really going to help us to get free.
Ashe. Amen.
Ashe.
That's it.
Amen. Amen. That's a
word.
Great note to end on. We through the whole thing, but we got it in, and it's going to be up online for people to learn from. Reverend Francois, just in case people didn't hear me, let people know that we want to thank everybody, and we're on our way out.
I think they heard you, Doc, because we heard you clearly. But thanks everyone for joining us. To my wonderful spiritual mother, and to my three sisters in the movement, three sisters in the fight for a glorious humanity here and now. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to the next episode of Preaching and Preachers, which Dr. Simmons will make sure we're all aware of. Ashe.
Ashe.
All
Much
right.
love,
As
y'all.
always, share the video. Share the video. Share the video. Share the